Comic book legend Stan Lee has died at the age of 95. Not only a writer, but also an editor, publisher of Marvel Comics at one point, and later on a film producer, just shy of his 96th birthday. This is the man who was responsible for so many of the comic book characters that we all know and love, and of course have made billions of dollars at the box office. Back in the 1960s, Stan Lee would help to create or co-create properties like Spider-Man and the Avengers and the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, and there's more. Iron Man, Doctor Strange, the Incredible Hulk, Ant-Man, so many of those would go on to become huge movie franchises. He actually began when he was just 17 years old in 1939 for the company that would eventually become Marvel Comics. He would take it in the early 1960s and turn it into a powerhouse, becoming a writer, an editor, and eventually the publisher, and really the point man, the front man for Marvel Comics for so long. He also made cameo appearances in all of those Marvel movies, also on The Big Bang Theory. Stan Lee has died at the age of 95. Stars are paying tribute to him, including Canadian actor Ryan Reynolds. Of course, Ryan Reynolds playing Deadpool from the Marvel Universe, but also playing Green Lantern at one point, writing this: "Damn, rest in peace, Stan. Thanks for everything." For more on this, we've got Jason Rockman joining us from the city of Montreal, entertainment commentator, huge fan of Stan Lee, has met him as I have. Jason, your thoughts when you heard this news?
You and I were there together when we met him. It was my second time meeting him, and I remember your face after meeting him. You were like a little kid, and that's what happens when you had the chance to meet Stan Lee. It was like touching the hand of a god for people like you, and I know for people like me. It's sad because this is a guy that created everything that I grew up on and everything that has become the most popular stuff in pop culture. He co-created a lot of these characters with Jack Kirby. He's a true originator and broke down a lot of boundaries for a lot of people. So his passing is monumental today.
When we talked about all of the different properties, the characters that he was responsible for creating, I mean, it is astonishing to think that this guy, along with, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and some of these classic artists, could come up with so many of these superhero characters. I mean, here he is, with the Spider-Man pose there. It's quite remarkable that it would all come from just a core group of people led to a large extent by Stan Lee.
It was Stan obviously had a very interesting childhood. He came from European immigrants. He was living in New York, and I think a lot of his own stuff that he was dealing with in his life was reflected in these characters that he created. The idea of Peter Parker being the struggling student who had all these ups and downs, but had these superpowers, but had to balance all this power that he had with being a good nephew to his aunt, and still trying to be a good person, and still getting bullied at school. And it was just everything that any normal person could relate to. And I think a lot of these character traits that the heroes had that Stan created reflected on how he was feeling it in his own life.
You raise a great point. Was the son of Jewish immigrants, Stan Lieber, his original name that he shortened to Stan Lee. The idea of, and Marvel has always been great at this, Jason, of the outsider, as something that Stan Lee himself faced, and the idea that these characters that he would create, they weren't perfect people. They were humans. They went through all sorts of adversity, and they had their own demons and their own foibles, and that is what made Marvel Comics so interesting, whereas, some of the other comics at the time didn't do that. These were sort of iconic characters, but Marvel characters were humans, first and foremost.
Well, yeah, and you look at the DC universe. They were a little bit more grandiose. There's a bit more of a distance between the person, the reader, and the hero. But Marvel, you could relate to these characters. I mean, you look at the X-Men, and I mean that's another great cast of characters that Lee created. The X-Men were every teenager that just didn't fit in, that felt they were a little bit different. The mutants. I mean, there's such a parallel when you're in high school and you don't feel like you fit in with anybody, or you're in school and you don't feel like you fit in. And then these people would band together and they would find a professor like Professor X who would bring them together and say, "No, I know your abilities are special. I'm going to help you learn how to cope with them." And it's iconic stuff. And it's so ironic how all of this stuff has now become so big in popular culture, and everyone who, not necessarily comic book readers, are huge fans of these characters because they're great stories. And there's a plethora of movie scripts in the Marvel canon that are going to be used over the years because there's great stories there.
What was also amazing was the fact that Marvel realized this, and he sometimes had a difficult relationship with the company over the years, certainly in the 80s and 90s, but that they realized his value, and so he was given these sort of cameo appearances in all of these different films, and no doubt there were others that were shot that will be in upcoming Marvel films, such as Captain Marvel and Avengers Infinity War 4. I'm curious as well, you know this and I know this. He was always a class act. I mean, even meeting this guy, despite his stature in this industry, he was very humble, and he would still, be signing comic books, and he was still very passionate about it, even, well into his 90s. Pretty remarkable.
I brought my picture I have of Stan and I that I got taken together, and there's his autograph. And I remember I took the picture, and then the next day I went to get it autographed, and I said, I even have some characters that you created tattooed on my arm. And he looked at me and goes, "Why would you want to go do that? That's so dumb." But he just had a certain type of energy and this youthfulness about him that was infectious and contagious. And you would see him walking through these convention floors to get to his signings, and there'd be these huge signings, and he's not getting wheeled there. We'd be walking there with a couple of security guards next to him, and this is well into his 90s. I got to meet him again the year before last with my son. I brought him to San Diego Comic-Con. It was one of his last appearances at San Diego, and I paid for the meet and greet for my son. And at the time he was 13, and he tells me it's one of the greatest moments of his life because meeting Stan was just so monumental to him. He had that effect on people.
Jason, appreciate it. We'll always have the characters, of course, and the man and all he did for the industry. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. And Excelsior.
Excelsior, yeah, of course, Stan Lee's famous slogan.